Welcome back to Viewpoint. Later on, we're going to be catching up with Christine Forster and Nicholas Rees to talk through the week's events. But first up, we're going to go on the front line. And tonight, I'm joined from Brisbane by Terry Butler, who's the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary to Bill Shorten. Good to see you, Terry.
Great to be here.
And from Melbourne, Senator James Paterson, Liberal Senator from Melbourne, novice Liberal Senator from Melbourne. Good to see you, James.
Indeed. Thank you, Chris.
Before we get into the issues of the day, well, actually, let's do Orlando first. Tragic events. But you might have heard me at the start. I get terribly frustrated that many of our political figures from all sides of politics refuse to mouth the words Islamist extremism. They'll talk about terrorism this or armed insurrection that. Terry, why is it so difficult for politicians to talk about Islamist extremism?
I'm not sure it is, Chris. I think that in this particular case, there's been a lot of conflicting reports. It seems like he was someone who was violent and abusive towards his wife, someone who was deeply racist. Some of the reports say that he wasn't religious. I know that he claimed he was acting as part of the Islamic State, but it seems like one of those, situations where someone is claiming that, but you don't know really whether that's a after-the-fact justification for their hatred or something that was actually motivating them. I think generally, though, when you talk about what's happening in the Middle East, people are fairly blunt about the fact that it is religious extremism, and in that case, extremism in people's particularly radical interpretation of Islam.
Yeah, I think the problem comes when we have domestic events and people are loath to call it out, but you would have no qualms in saying that Islamist extremism is the domestic threat we face now?
Look, I think that the threat, and I've been really, pretty blunt about this, the threat is extremism. And you find that there is a lot of hate in the community. And in my view, you don't cure hate by having more hate encouraged within the community. But certainly the Islamic organisations that I talk to, and I talk to them fairly often, do take seriously the threat of radicalisation and extremism. And so they work to make sure that young kids, particularly young men, teenagers, are included in the community. The Islamic Society in my electorate has a gym. There's a chap there who runs a training company. They work towards getting people included and part of communities so that they can counter, this task that people have of countering violent extremism through community and through inclusion. And I think that the real issue that people have is wanting to really strongly and sensibly avoid encouraging further hate, because that will not help anybody.
No, that's exactly the case. And James, it's not surprising. Of course, Muslim communities know about the risks of extremism because it's emanating from their communities. And of course, we need to be able to call out Islamist extremism because we need to work with Muslim communities to try and stop radicalisation occurring. We don't do anybody any favours by trying to conduct verbal gymnastics to get around it.
Yeah, I agree, Chris. I think we should be direct and plain, as you have been, as Jim Molan was earlier on this program, and as the Prime Minister was today. He said, the early, very strong indications are that this has an Islamist flavour to it, that it appears to be motivated by that. And it's an attack on not just the gay community, most obviously, but through them, all of us who want to live in a free society, in a free, open society. These were people who were doing nothing other than having a good night out with friends, having a celebration, and they were targeted for that. And that is a terrifying thing for all of us, and something that we must stand resolutely against.
Well, and this is the reason...
Well, they were targeted because they were gay. I mean, let's be honest, that's why they were targeted. We're talking
about... That's right, that's what I said.
But Islamist extremists, one of their pet hates is homosexuality, gays and lesbians, and some preach that they should be put to death. We've seen examples of that. And I suppose, James, the point here is why you need to talk about it is people need to understand the threat. So much of the commentary you get in the West is that somehow we've provoked Islamist extremism. Somehow it's a reaction to foreign policy, or somehow it's reaction to the exclusion of youth. But in fact, this is an ideology that is totally opposed to all the plurality and democracy we stand for and our tolerance for groups like gays and lesbians.
Well, Chris, I think they're opposed to modernity. I mean, I'm not sure what the gay men in the Middle East who are thrown off buildings have done, what foreign policy crimes they've committed, or the women who are stoned for adultery. I'm not sure what foreign policy crimes they've committed. This is the natural extension of that. It will be happening in the West as it has been happening in the Middle East for a long time. And it is opposed to modernity, it is opposed to pluralism and tolerance and a liberal free society. And that's why we all must stand firm against it.
Well, as I say, our hearts still go out to those in the United States, of course, over this, still dealing with this tragedy. Let's move on to the world of domestic politics. And Terry, what have been the issues that people have been stopping you on the street about this week?
Oh, look, it's such a diverse electorate. It's really it's fascinating being a marginal seat holder in an inner city electorate. But certainly people are particularly worried about healthcare. They're worried about education. There's a lot of concern about NBN. And certainly, you know, Chris, people are very interested in this question of where in the long term growth is going to come from. And so people are taking a very close look at the different parties' views about the economy and the future of the nation economically. And it's really interesting. You know, I think there's a lot of concern out in my electorate particularly. It's a fairly wealthy electorate by comparison to some of the other places in this country. And yet people are really worried that their kids aren't going to be able to afford to buy a house. You're still seeing this phenomenon of people in their 30s living at home because they can't manage to save the deposit to buy a house, or even if they can, they're on contract or casual work, and it's hard for them to get a loan.
So if people are worried about these economic issues, then they must be deeply worried about Labor's announcement last week that every year of the next term in government, should they win, they would go deeper, you would go deeper into deficit than the coalition has budgeted for.
You'd be well aware, Chris, that each of the four parties will have a deficit in the forthcoming 4 years.
Absolutely, as I said, deeper into deficit.
To be back in balance in the same year, and you'd also know that we think that it's important for politicians, for all politicians, to take both an immediate view and a longer-term view. And in fact, almost everyone I speak to who's a constituent says, why don't politicians think beyond the election cycle? Well, we are thinking beyond the election cycle. We think that when it comes to growth, 0.6% of gross national income increase over the medium term, over, say, a decade, is a very, very small dividend from giving away $48.2 billion in revenue. We think that there is an opportunity for us now as a nation to think about where growth is going to come from, and that seems to us to be fairly clear, not just our view but the view of the OECD, that if you improve education then you actually improve people's future soft skills like resilience, actual content skills, the skills that they'll need for the jobs of the future. And so there's a real question for people about, you know, you can talk about the short term or you can talk about the future of the nation, and we have been quite deliberately talking about the future of the nation, and we've been doing that because, you know, you can say, oh look, the deficits will be bigger in the 4-year period, but the reason that is the case is because we want to reverse Malcolm Turnbull's $2 billion in cuts to Medicare funding. We don't accept that there has to be, for example, in my state, $6 billion worth of cuts to education funding over a decade. And those things are not just social policies. Those things are economic policies. Let's not mince words.
Yeah, James, this should be a gift for the government. You want to say that Labor can't be trusted with the finances. They put the place into debt to start with, and they're going to go deeper into debt now. Yet you haven't really cut through on that message. I suppose you're paying the price. The coalition is paying the price for not doing enough budget repair itself.
Well, Chris, this weekend I was out in some marginal seats in the southeast of Melbourne, in Chisholm and Bruce on Saturday and in Dunkley on Sunday. And I can tell you there is a great degree of concern in the community about Bill Shorten's capacity to pay for his promises. There is a growing awareness about the debt and deficit challenges that Australia faces. And every time Bill Shorten is out there promising $1 billion here and $1 billion there, just throwing it on the spendometer, people wonder, how is that going to be paid for? Will he ever deliver it? And frankly, I think they doubt, as they should, the sincerity of the Labor Party in the savings measures that they have announced. Because these savings measures are just backing initiatives that the coalition has tried to legislate over the last 3 years, and that they have fought every step of the way.
There's some backdowns there.
Including some very modest changes to pensions, a very sensible change, I think, to the school kids bonus. 3 years of hard-fought battles in the Parliament, they've turned around and said, oh, by the way, just ignore all of that, we're going to pass these savings measures ourselves.
You've got to
I seriously doubt they will.
You've got to give Bill Shorten some credit, though. He's been up front. He is saying that we will go deeper into deficit for each year of the next term of government. It's not very often you get a politician get up before an election and say that they'll actually have deeper deficits. Full marks for honesty, surely.
That's right, Chris, and full credit to Chris Bowen, who said that the AAA credit rating is at risk, and it certainly will be if he's returned as Treasurer, and particularly will be if we have a minority government where the Greens will be in coalition with Labor. This is the real threat that we face now that Labor has announced they're going to preference the Greens in every of the 150 House of Representatives seats in this country and in the Senate across the country. That's the kind of coalition government that Labor would be leading.
Yeah, Terry Butler, how do you feel about this Greens issue? Kind of nice of the Liberal Party to put the Greens behind Labor in every seat. It's going to help some of your colleagues like Anthony Albanese and Tanya Plibersek, but you are tarred with this brush of relying on Green preferences.
Oh, look, Chris, I think people will make their own decision about how they vote, but I mean, this is really a question about the future of the nation, and you just had a senator complain about the fact that we've got an alternative government that actually wants to fund health and education properly over the forward estimates. And look, you know,
well, hang on a second. You said
$57
billion have been cut from health, and you're going to
complain
put
about the
$2 back
AAA
in.
credit rating when they know that when we left government, net debt was at 12% and it's now heading towards 18%. They know that it was Labor that maintained the AAA credit rating, and it's the Liberals' deficits that have put us into the situation that we're in now. I mean, they've tripled the deficit for the 16-17 financial year compared to their own forecasts 2 years ago.
All right, yeah, we love those forecasts. We love those
forecasts.
forecasts.
Can point the finger at us and complain about budgets.
According to your neighbour there in Queensland, Wayne Swan, we're still in surplus at the moment. Let's leave the economic debate for a minute and go to something specific. And this is the return of former Prime Minister Bob Hawke. He's injected himself into the campaign through a prepared advertisement on Medicare. Let's just have a look at that.
In 1983, the Hawke Labor government introduced Medicare. The Liberals were totally against it. And now the Liberals have set up a Medicare privatisation task force. Everybody knows you don't set up a Medicare privatisation task force unless you aim to privatise Medicare.
A very recognisable voice there, Terry Butler. But where's the evidence that there's a privatisation task force?
Are you asking me where the evidence is for Bob's ad?
Yeah.
That's flattering. Look,
well, Labor, you're campaigning for the Labor Party. Labor is saying there's a privatisation task force. I saw Matthias Cormann deny that outright earlier today.
Well, James, I mean, you're in the Senate. As far as I know, it's been confirmed in Senate estimates, but I have to say it's not my portfolio. My portfolio is family and domestic violence, and those.
James, is there a Medicare privatisation task force?
No, Chris, as you know, there isn't. And, of course, you can't prove a negative, but if the Labor Party says that there's a Medicare privatisation task force, I'm sure they can prove that. I welcome Bob Hawke's entry into the debate about Medicare, though, Chris. I think Bob tried to do some very sensible things in Medicare, and I wonder if Labor might like to listen to some of the things he did. But you can compare where Medicare is today to where it was under Bob Hawke.
You're not suggesting a Medicare co-payment, are you?
50% of people...
What happened to Bob Hawke
Chris,
after he suggested that Medicare co-payment? Did he lose the leadership? That's how I understand it.
50% of Australians were getting their Medicare bulk billed when they were seeing a GP. Now, under the Liberal Party, 85% of Australians are. So is Labor going to turn the clock back to 50% rates of bulk billing? Are they going to go back and embrace Bob Hawke's policy of a Medicare co-payment? Is that the route they want to go down? If he's the person that they say we should listen to on Medicare, then I invite them to follow his advice.
But are you saying that you still favour a Medicare co-payment, James Paterson?
Well, Chris, it's pretty clear that that's gone nowhere in the last term of Parliament and is going nowhere at this stage. It's not a proposal that the government is pursuing. It's not a proposal that has the support of the Parliament. But it is a proposal that Bob Hawke advocated and, in fact, implemented. And if the Labor Party says he's the man to listen to on Medicare, then I await their announcement of their Medicare co-payment policy.
Well, you've just spelled the cat, I think, Senator, because it's pretty clear that your party remains just as committed to a Medicare co-payment as it always has been. You know that you actually want to do this. It's something that you tried to do overtly. We and the community campaign that was mounted against that co-payment were successful in preventing it. You've then brought in this co-payment by stealth, this increase to the price of going to the doctor for people, whether they're bulk billed or not, by forcing doctors to pass on the cut in real terms to patients. I think that it's pretty clear for Australians, and you're really just confirming what Bob Hawke is saying, that the Liberal Party's never supported Medicare. You've never supported universal healthcare. At every opportunity that you've had to undermine the universality of healthcare, you've done so.
Although, as James pointed out, those figures are undeniable, the higher levels of bulk billing. We do need to leave it there. A very interesting debate.
Just quickly, Chris, not only are they...
Always a pleasure, Chris. Thank
we
you
do
very
have to
much.
leave
Not
it
only
there.
are they higher now than they were under Bob Hawke, they're higher than they were under the previous Labor government, Chris.
What I think is interesting is that the money spent by Labor to get Bob Hawke up there in a Medicare ad has probably worked already, because
I think the $2 billion cut to Medicare is probably more interesting
I
than
think
that.
it's a debate Labor wants to have. We'll catch up with you again before the campaign ends. Thanks for joining us, Terry Butler, James Paterson.
Thanks, Chris.